Hi, Mark. Welcome to Infinix Office Hours. How are you doing?
Great, David. It's great to be here. Great to join you today.
Yeah, good to see you again and interact with you. For those that have dialed in and aren't aware of who Mark Morsch is, Mark and I have a little bit of a personal connection. We've actually known each other, I don't know if this is kind of scary to say, but for a couple decades actually now. That would be 2+ decades. Mark and I worked at a startup in San Diego called A-Life Medical that ended up being acquired by Optum. But really, Mark is the brains behind natural language processing and coined the phrase computer assisted coding back in the day when we pushed computer assisted coding into the market. So, Mark, why don't you give the audience a little bit of background on NLP and how you introduced NLP to the healthcare market?
Yeah, just to making a long story short, which is kind of interesting. Healthcare has needed NLP for quite a while, and it's only grown, with the adoption of electronic health records. But back those couple decades ago, there was a real gap, in the medical coding space, and a real need, as a follow-on to transcription. And back then, I was working actually in the defense industry, working in defense intelligence industry, and we were working on projects back, reading General Schwarzkopf's email messages and trying to make sense of logistics, where things were and when they were going to get to the right places at the right times. So that was fun. But then kind of this healthcare application came along to kind of read transcriptions and be able to assign ICD and CPT codes for billing. So that was it turned into a really interesting problem, and we started off in a couple different specialty areas, and there was some fits and starts, and it was around about the same time kind of internet-based applications were really just getting started. So they were in their infancy, back in that time. So you combine that with kind of growing computing power, also emerging at that time, because much before 2 decades ago, you had to have some really large, expensive hardware to do NLP. So when that changed with PCs getting really powerful, or much more powerful, we were able to kind of apply our technology and develop some new interesting technologies that could, actually tackle a problem to, capture information from physician notes. At that point, it was transcribed notes, but then over the years, it's, turned into, the EMR-based notes, which are, predominant today.
Right. And so I think early on at A-Life, when we started out, we went after the emergency medicine market, and we quickly realized at that time, and this is, again, dating ourselves, pre-really EMR, we found out that they didn't have much electronic documentation, if any at all. Everything was on like T-system notes or whatever back in the day.
Yeah, we were competing with paper back then, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. We've come so far, Mark. So where does NLP fit best in today's healthcare world? And what should people, the buyers out there, look at when they're evaluating an NLP-like tool?
Yeah, so NLP has grown a lot. I don't want to use the word mature attached to NLP, because I think there's still quite a bit more to go. There's certain applications where it's mature in, but certainly with the widespread adoption of electronic health records, digital data is widely available or widely produced. Availability might be a little bit more of a challenge in a lot of instances, but it's widely produced. So it's out there. The digital data is available. And so, for applications like in the rev cycle space, mid-rev cycle, in coding and documentation improvement, where you need the NLP to kind of capture those key facts, and you're looking to really augment or in some place partially automate, a human in this process. There's often medical coders are a hard group to hire these days and train and get them, working at their top efficiency, and documentation improvement specialists and the like, as well as auditors are similar veins. So NLP is really great being able to, assist those different specialists, and we're talking kind of an administrative side, assist those specialists in either partially automating their work to assign codes or finding documentation gaps for clinical documentation improvement. And that is where NLP is really proving its value today, in a lot of different areas, both outpatient and inpatient. And so I think there's NLP though is, I think about it as how it fits into a whole continuum in terms of a pipeline of different processes across RCM, whether it be the front, middle, and back. So it's often about NLP and how it fits in with the other stages of the process where you really get the value.
So when you talk about front, middle, and back, can you kind of expand on that a little bit, like CDI to coding to what do you see on the back end where NLP comes into play? Maybe a little more color around that.
Sure. And starting off, kind of at the heart of it, kind of where we started a couple of decades ago, right in the middle of the revenue cycle is medical coding. And, you mentioned emergency medicine and kind of the initial sweet spots was different medical specialty areas, primarily physician focused, where you had a physician creating, a single physician note and a self-contained record, and that could represent the full amount of information you need to assign CPT and ICD-10 codes, or ICD-9 back then, to go into a bill. So that, that remains a solid application. There's newer players in that space of medical coding that are, applying some of the newer AI technologies and machine learning and deep learning. So that continues to be a, kind of an area there's quite a bit of activity in, because really it's motivated by, to a large extent on the physician side and the outpatient side, by automation, the opportunity to automate and to get a more consistent, result, across a large volume of data. So, but up front, more towards the front end, talked about CDI, clinical documentation improvements, where you're looking for, where you're more interacting with, the creation of the documentation. This is where you're, more closely integrating with EMRs and kind of identifying those gaps in documentation where, it might be advantageous to a physician to explain in a little more clarity, a certain diagnosis, to allow it to be coded. One of the examples we talked about when we were first developing these applications were, a patient with a bicycle accident that was gone in for an MRI, and the physician didn't fully explain that they had a aneurysm or a cerebral hematoma. They didn't use those words. Well, because they didn't use those words, a coder can't assign the codes. They might have said midline shift on the radiology report. So that's the kind of thing where NLP can go in and find that clinical language, pull it out and say, okay, if this isn't encodable language, then you've got a problem. You've got a potential gap because you've got a missing, very important, valuable, both, from a reimbursement standpoint, even potentially a clinical standpoint, a valuable diagnosis that might be hidden, the code might not get its way into the chart, even though it's, documented and maybe a bit buried inside the radiologist note.
Right.
Yeah. And I mentioned the back end, the back end, the kind of the mirror image of coding is auditing, kind of the review. And so when you're either, on the provider side, having to deal with both doing QA on your own RCM staff to making sure that you're sending out, appropriate bills that they're substantiated by the medical record, as well as when you're kind of even a bit on the payer side. Payers are using this technology, this NLP technology, to audit, provider charts. So what they've done for years with human teams of auditors, they're using NLP to help automate and help find the charts that are potentially have the highest likelihood of an issue or an error.
Right. And you mentioned artificial intelligence and machine learning. There's a lot of buzzwords around those two technologies, and deep learning comes into play too, or is starting to come into play, I'd say, more and more. But from a layman's standpoint, what's the difference between machine learning and artificial intelligence? How would you describe the difference between the two?
Oh, sure. I mean, it's a great question because you hear those buzzwords tossed around: AI, ML, deep learning, DL, all the time. Because if you don't have AI these days, you're not keeping up. It seems like if you're a vendor.
Right.
So, but
Yeah.
really, you think about AI as I think about it as a big umbrella. It's the big term. So it includes a lot of different technologies: computer vision, robotics. It includes NLP, natural language processing. It also, an important branch of it is machine learning. And machine learning has really kind of grown, in some ways exploded over the last decade because of some breakthroughs, about 10 years ago, that allowed these algorithms to go from, machine learning, which is learning from data, learning from examples. So it's taking the example results that you desire. For instance, if you're interpreting an X-ray and you want to find the places where an X-ray has a fracture in a bone, you show these algorithms a bunch of examples that are annotated with the fractures, and then the machine learning algorithm, kind of learns how to identify fractures in a radiological image. So that's different than NLP, but you can do the same kind of thing in NLP too, by present text or in physician notes that might have a specific coding result if you're trying to learn coding, and annotate the parts of the note that have that code. So machine learning kind of took off 10 years ago with the invention of algorithms that it kind of married machine learning and neural networks. So neural networks allow much more complex machine learning to take place. What that meant was you could really teach a machine now to handle much more complex images. So when in the radiology is the best example of that, because it went from pretty not great recognition of radiological images by algorithms to, in the last 10 years, you've got hundreds of FDA cleared algorithms that can now assist a radiologist in interpreting radiology images. And so these are used inside workflows every day. And these are an example of deep learning in action, which is a part of AI, but it's this latest innovation, which is really been adopted a lot, especially in radiology.
So when a consumer is out there looking at a solution that's AI based, let's bring it back to revenue cycle management. How do you validate that vendor truly has AI, or it's not just some fancy script that has been written by a programmer? How should a buyer walk in to one of these solutions and kind of evaluate, do you really have AI and the capabilities that you say you have, or is it kind of mimicking what AI could potentially do?
Yeah, it's a great place to be a little bit educated in what's out there in terms of AI, because AI can mean the most sophisticated deep learning algorithms that are out there, all the way to the business rules, which are built into all sorts of desktop applications now. And at one point, right, business rules were expert systems; those were cutting edge. And expert systems have a lot of places where they are used and used widely, especially in built into EHRs. But you need to ask questions about the underlying technology in the AI. If it's machine learning, it really is important to understand how was the algorithm that's in operation, how was it trained, what kind of data was it trained on, how often does it released? Because people hear machine learning and they often assume, it learns as it goes, it gets smarter day by day, because that's what we hope people do. But actually, most machine learning doesn't do that. It's taught and built. A model is built, which is an algorithm based upon training from certain data, and it's released, and then it's only updated based upon some developers or some data scientists retraining that model based on new data. So you want to be able to kind of understand a little bit more about how the data works with the model and how often that model gets updated if it's machine learning, and who validates the model. Does it the vendor? Is it the user? Is it both? Because it's important, especially in healthcare, whether it's an RCM application and whether it's something that's even on the clinical side, it's very important that you understand how those machine learning algorithms are kept high performing over time. And ideally, they're going to improve. You're going to continuously, be able to get better results and get more efficiency and more accuracy and more productivity. But be able to kind of interrogate the vendors, to sufficiency that they can get you comfortable with the process of both the underlying technology, the value it's bringing. That's important to understand. Kind of what's the impact of it, and then how it's going to, operate over time. Because I think that operational aspect is something that a lot of AI developers often don't think about. They're focused on getting to the release, but then we in the operational world have to worry about, okay, I got to keep it. It has to work today, tomorrow, next week, next year.
Right, exactly. And you brought up some good points there. So, in your experience with AI, ML, NLP, how do people or buyers evaluate the ROI? And I have my own thoughts, but one of the things that comes to mind right now is, staffing shortages across healthcare. It's at the hospital level, it's at the facility level, it's at the physician group level. So just based on your experience and, working at Optum for as many years as you did, what's like one of the major components to focus on ROI when it comes to an AI type solution?
Yeah, I mean, you really have to have real clarity in terms of the benefit and the value for the application. For physician coding, the primary benefit was often, automation. What level of automation could you reach, for that middle revenue cycle and coding? For areas like documentation improvement, it's much more of a revenue-based value. In terms of, is there missed revenue opportunities that aren't captured or missed because there's no staff to look at it, or they just, can't get to all these different types of opportunities? Is CDI powered by NLP able to help with that? So I think, it really needs to be, the ROI needs to be targeted to the specific application, and it needs to be measurable, of course. And I think, case studies are a great, thing to look for, from any vendor to say, okay, where have you done it before, like me or like this. Now, if you want to be an early adopter, that's exciting too, because you can believe in the promise. But, we've gone through plenty of early adopters out there that have been really happy. And then you're taking a bit of a risk there. But that is, being able to have that clear ROI, whether it be based upon, automation, which is efficient, which is essentially being able to do more work with the same or less labor, revenue, be able to capture more revenue, timing, be able to turn around bills faster, making the whole rev cycle process more accurate, more efficient. In the authorization process, if you can, authorize and have, fewer denials, denial reduction, that can be connected with NLP as well as, other steps inside revenue cycle. So, I think those really practical business measures, are really good ways to measure NLP. Now, there's more technical measures of NLP, things like recall and precision that are out there.
Yep.
And those are, I think, good to ask about, but, those are also less comparable, between vendors than other, kind of harder business metrics. So, it's good to, and you can sniff out, kind of false claims, because somebody says, oh, it's 100%, 100% perfect. Then, that's not true. It's like your Tesla is full self-driving. Well, not really.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Exactly. And you bring out some good components there to look at, like the value and the ROI. If you have accuracy, if you have quicker turnaround time, less denials, then that means you're going to have way less more write-offs, which gets back to the revenue generation that you're talking about. Just one last question before we wrap up, and this is another buzzword that's come into play, and you kind of wrapped it under AI, which to be honest, I was a little bit surprised about, but you know more about it than I do. So, bots. So
bots, right?
Bots, yep. Yeah. That is the new buzzword, and I've asked around. And I'm like, because going back to old school, right? What's the difference between a bot and a script? Because it seems like it's the same to me. But so from your perspective, what exactly is a bot?
Well, I think a bot it's a more, it's a trendier term, but it's really typically a self-contained specific application and targeted at automating or assisting a certain stage in a process. So it's really, a bot typically has a limited, very focused application. It might be a bot for going out there and identifying, looking at a set of payers if you're trying to identify kind of how to get prior authorization based upon, and getting access to the information. So a bot might be smart enough to know where all these payers' websites are and be able to have a way to log in and get the information from a whole bunch of payers. Now, that's not really AI necessarily, but it is automation and requires a level of intelligence and flexibility that we typically look for people to do. So, we usually depend upon a person to log into 10 different sites and know where to find the information and things like that, on different payer websites and things like that, or comb through data. You can have a bot that automates a lot of that because it's often pretty formulaic. Some of these stages are pretty formulaic in what they do. So, bots can have AI embedded in them, if depending upon what they need to do, especially if they need to capture information. That's, if you're capturing information from forms or from other websites and things like that, where it needs to be, you have to kind of interpret the context around information. So it's AI, but it's AI at a different level. It's often AI at capturing information and categorizing it correctly, like from a medical form or from a billing form or from an EOB, things like that. So that's how I think about bots, is really, and bots are, very, very impactful potentially, because they can provide that automation.
So I'll leave the last thought with you, but is there any other technology advancements that you see coming out that's going to have an impact on healthcare, RCM? You see anything that's cutting edge that people should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer in AI, of course, and I'll leave you with a couple of thoughts. One is that just, I think that technology that can take a EMR note or an EMR record and kind of pre-validate it to clear it for submission. So kind of taking pre-authorization almost a step further, to be able to kind of almost pre-code and pre-validate. I think is a really interesting area, and I think payers are really interested in doing that in certain opportunities. But I think that's one area that's out there. But I'll leave you with one piece of data also, that why AI is essentially essential in healthcare, and that is, based on some recent data, each patient is generating 80 megabytes of new data per year. That's each patient on average, 80 megabytes of new. That includes imaging data, EMR data, test, diagnostic tests, and that's the average. You think about, your high utilizing patients, the scope of that data. So, does your physician and your biller have time to look at all this when they're trying to? No. So, that's why AI, that's why, bots are, automation is so essential, I think, is because, the digital data has just exploded and will continue to grow at a breakneck pace.
Yeah, and it's already starting to overwhelm physicians. I mean, it's been the EMR, the introduction of EMR and documenting and taking away from patient face time. So, yeah, I agree with you. The data is only going to grow more and more. So, well, Mark, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'll let you get back to decorating for the holidays. And
that's why I'm in the garage here.
Really appreciate everything that you provided today.
Happy to. Good to talk to you.
Thank you. Good talking to you. Bye.